Hi, Grandma here, and I'm reading by The Great Horn Spoon by Sid Fleischman, chapter 14. In chapter 13, we had an interesting development. First of all, Jack accidentally bid on a barrel of neckties.
Yeah.
He was trying to tell someone they'd already eaten, and he said 8, and the auctioneer said that was a bid. But then Quartz Jackson came back to town with his new bride, and the men in town hadn't seen a woman for months. And Praiseworthy cleaned himself up and Jack up, and they put on a necktie, and other men decided they wanted neckties too. So Jack was able to sell all the neckties, and hopefully he had enough money to buy a burro so they could go prospecting, which I think has happened because chapter 14 is called The Prospectors, and we see somebody riding possibly a mule. When Jack awoke the next morning, he threw off his blanket and rushed outside to see if their burro was still there. It was, tied to a stake outside the tent. "Good morning, Stub," Jack smiled. Stub was a veteran of gold diggings. He gave Jack a haughty look. "Stub's a proud animal," the man had said when they bought him. "Sometimes he thinks he's a mule. That's why he actually looks a little bit like a mule with him kicking like that." The burro's head seemed almost as large as his hindquarters, and his dark ears stood up like wings of a hawk. Jack liked him. "We're going to be friends," he said. "Yes, sir." He untied the burro and threw a leg over his back. Stub kicked out his hind legs, his tail flew, and Jack hit the dirt. The burro turned his thick head and peered at Jack with disdain. Jack was so surprised he just sat there. "Well, that wasn't very friendly," said Jack. Pitch Pine Billy, standing in the opening of his dusty tent, roared out laughing. "You heard what the man said, Jamocha Jack. He said that mountain canary thinks he's a mule." Jack brushed himself off. "All I wanted was to ride him." Pitch Pine Billy pulled a red bandana out of his pocket and came over. "The mules in these hills is still half wild." He tied the handkerchief around Stub's eyes. "They don't take kindly to being pack animals. You blindfold him first and they'll stand still." Now, that brings me to a question. What is a mule? A mule technically is a donkey and a horse that have had a baby, and it's called a hybrid. It has some characteristics like a donkey, some like a horse. Well, he said the mules in these parts are still half wild, which means that the mother, which is probably a wild horse, is wild and has never been domesticated. Or it's been a long, many, many years and has run free. So the mules are not as dependable as they are in other parts of the country. Okay, so moving on. Praiseworthy came out of his tent, stretched, and sat on a stump to watch. Daylight was filtering through the trees, and the morning had a fresh, piney smell. Jack walked around the burro, sizing him up. Then he spit in his hands, threw a leg over Stub's back, and held on. "Ready?" said Pitch Pine Billy. "Ready," said Jack. Pitch Pine Billy pulled out the bandana. Jack braced himself. Stub stood for a moment as if trying to make up his mind whether to act like a mule or a burro. "Good boy, Stub," Jack said tentatively. The burro flagged his ears and seemed satisfied that he had been shown the proper respect. He gave a little kick just to get it out of his system and behaved himself. Jack walked him up and back until breakfast was ready and slipped to the ground. "We got ourselves a good burro," he said to Praiseworthy. Stub gave a kick as if in protest. "Mule, I mean," Jack corrected himself. After breakfast, they struck the tent, blindfolded Stub and cinched the wooden pack saddle to his back. They loaded up their grub and supplies, slipped their pick and shovel through the pack ropes, and were ready to leave. Jimmy from town came over with Buffalo John, both still wearing their neckties from the night before. Pitch Pine Billy gazed out over the diggings. Hangtown just won't be the same with a lady in it. Goodbye, gents, Praiseworthy said. I have a good mind to leave with you, scowled Pitch Pine Billy. Other miners came over, and it took 5 minutes to get their goodbyes said. We'll be looking for you back come the middle of next month, said Buffalo John. You and the mountain ox. I'll be here, Praiseworthy said, taking the blindfold off Stubbs' face. Let's get going, partner. Now, if you remember in the previous chapter, word has gotten around that Praiseworthy is a good fighter, and someone has challenged him, and it will be in the middle of the next month. And they call that the person who challenged him a mountain ox because he's very, very big. And the men have placed bets on who would win. So Praiseworthy must come back. Praiseworthy picked up their new squirrel gun, and Jack took Stubbs' rope. The squirrel gun wasn't what Jack had in mind, like a 4-shooter, but it would do. They'd be able to hunt a little game, and he supposed it would stand off an outlaw or two if they met up with any. In jack boots and red shirts, they began walking upstream, and soon the farewell shouts of their friends were lost in the trees. It was a fine morning to be going prospecting, but Jack found it hard to walk away from Pitch Pine Billy and Jimmy from town, and even Buffalo John. Still, coming back would be even harder. Maybe the mountain ox isn't as big and terrible as they say he is, Jack murmured. Worse, no doubt, said Praiseworthy. He sounded positively lightheaded. Are you really going to come back and fight him? I gave my word, didn't I? Bare knuckle? Absolutely. Praiseworthy was not pleased that he'd won his name and reputation because he'd swung on a road angel with a weighted glove. Jack kept a grip on Stubbs' rope, and the animal followed with a clanging of drinking cups, coffee pot, gold pans, and empty tin cans. Jack had a sudden vision of his partner lying in the dust on the street, beaten and humiliated. Most of the miners are betting on mountain ox, he muttered. Praiseworthy scratched through his whiskers. I know that, but I intend to beat him. With reading and writing. Exactly. Praiseworthy pushed the slouch hat back on his head. Miss Arabella once asked me to destroy a book she found in her grandfather's library. If I remember correctly, it was called The Gentleman's Book of Boxing, or The Fine Art of Fisticuffs, Explained and Illustrated. She was afraid it might fall into the wrong hands, your hands. I suppose I don't mind telling you I didn't destroy it. I read it. I devoured it. Fascinating. I believe I could recite whole pages to you. Now, it stands to reason that the mountain ox has never read a book in his life. He's no doubt a mere brawler. Therefore, since I have outread him, I see no reason why I cannot outwit and outbox him. To be perfectly honest with you, I'm beginning to look forward to it. The two partners exchanged a glance and a smile and continued on their way. Jack put the mountain ox out of his mind. Do you want to carry our gun? Said Praiseworthy. I'd like to carry our gun, said Jack. He took it in the crook of his arm, while Praiseworthy led the burro and kept an eye out for rabbits, squirrels, savages, and outlaws. All they had to do now was to find pay dirt. Well, I'm not sure if the gun is going to be much help with what I think they're going to find on their trail. It looks like they're going to find a bear. The Man Who Couldn't Sit Down is the next chapter, and I'll read that the next time. Bye-bye.